Just in this last year, I want to share, I've been to Lebanon twice, back in March and then again in October, visiting refugee camps and refugee communities there. I was in Jordan as well in the fall, and I've been to Palestine and Israel a number of times, and I go to Afghanistan regularly. So I want to share a little bit to kind of complement what Phyllis put out there in terms of the stories of refugees and kind of what's happening in their lives. And I want to start with two proverbs. Neither one from the Middle East, but one from Afghanistan, because I love Afghan proverbs, if folks are not familiar, are just terrific. So ask me about others if I forget. And then one from Africa as well. So the Afghan proverb is about Kabul, the capital, is in a basin at a very high altitude of like 6,500 feet, and it's surrounded by mountains. And the saying is, more precious than gold is snow on the mountains of Kabul. And they shared that because it doesn't rain in Afghanistan. It snows in the winter. And in the spring, farmers can look up at the mountains and know, is there enough water in the snow melt for our crops to get to harvest? Or will our sons, and it was usually sons, need to go somewhere else to find work for our family to survive? That's without any of the politics, that's without any of the weapons that have flooded Afghanistan, that for centuries they understood in a drought-prone region, you need to move and adjust just to survive. And I think that if we look at the Middle East as well, where there is significant fragility in the ecosystem in terms of water resources, apart from any of the politics and the war, there are folks that are making those decisions as well. There's not enough water for our crops. And that was one of the things facing Syrian farmers, was about subsidies and how they could make a go of it. And so I just put that as a backdrop in terms of people being on the move. And then when you add a flood of weapons from outside, from a whole lot of sources, as Phyllis was mentioning, it's a recipe for disaster. And the second proverb is from Africa. I first heard it years ago, actually around the end of the Cold War, 1989, 1990. He was a Nigerian ambassador at the UN. And he said, you know, there's a Swahili proverb, African proverb from different contexts. When two elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. He said, now suddenly the Cold War is ending and the two elephants are making love. And you know what? The grass is still being trampled. So just for right now, in this next month or so, I'd like to add to that a kind of third, maybe this is a US, North American version, that when elephants debate, the grass also gets trampled. So, you know, think about that proverb there. But that's a very serious aspect of how refugees have been politicized by governmental leaders, especially in this country, increasingly by some factions in Europe, and certainly in areas of the Middle East. It's the politicization. So I want to touch on just kind of four aspects in the kind of dynamic of uprooted, displaced persons. In some sense, refugees technically are those that have crossed an international border. But there's many folks who flee. Internally displaced persons, IDPs is another term that's used, but uprooted is also like folks flee. If there's not enough water for your crops, you will move. If there is fighting in your community, a lot of folks are just going to say, I'm out of here. Not for, hopefully for not long. And until recently, with the situation in Syria and Iraq and across the Middle East, Afghanistan was the largest refugee crisis. Palestine was the most long-standing refugee crisis. And I think that if we keep in mind what's happened with Afghan refugees who are still waiting to return, they're in Pakistan, they're in Iran, or they've returned and there's no land to return to. So they're in the cities with precarious jobs of what they can find. And Afghanistan now is more violent than ever in the last couple of years. And so this is over 40 years of displacement, when all that time weapons have been flooding in from the United States through the largest CIA covert operation from the Soviet Union, from Saudi Arabia, from Pakistan, you name it, the list goes on. And that same dynamic, and I keep raising Afghanistan because in many ways the situation in Syria now is developing into this kind of dynamic of where a lot of groups are flooding it with weapons. And so we won't be able to address the situations of refugees. Is this still working here?
Yeah, if you could get a little closer, it would be
Okay,
helpful.
I didn't have enough for dinner, so I'll try and have a microphone as well. Is that better, hopefully?
You also have to raise your voice.
Okay, I'll keep going. And
No problem.
So in terms of refugees, I want to identify kind of 4 aspects of what is it that we can do. One is, first of all, the right to stay. Wouldn't it be great if folks didn't need to flee their communities in the first place? So what steps can be done to ensure that communities and individuals and families feel safe enough in their home communities to stay? And so that's one area. The second area is protection on the journey. So when folks have fled, they're often on the road. That's when they're most vulnerable to trafficking, to exploitation, sexual harassment for women refugees and for children. So there's incredible vulnerabilities there, but that's another element of protection in terms of how are their human rights upheld as they're kind of on the move. The third area is in terms of welcoming the communities where they arrive initially. And throughout history, most refugees and uprooted peoples have fled just enough to get out of the way. If there's an earthquake in California, folks generally move to New York. They move a little ways away. So if you look at like Nepal, natural disasters, but also with human crises of war and human rights violations, people move with the hope that they can return soon. So most of the refugees are in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan. They fled across the border. There's actually a lot of back and forth. In a number of places, when things quiet down, folks will say, well, part of the family will go back. Maybe not all the family left. And so many families are divided right now, with some in Syria, some in Lebanon, some having gone on to Europe, some in Canada or other places, some in Jordan. And so this division of families and communities is also a part of that. So that's the third, is what kind of welcome is there in the host communities, which are usually the countries right nearby, or the internally displaced that have moved from like one town to another in Iraq or Syria. And finally is the right of return. Like, what enables people to be able to return? And what I saw in Lebanon was, which is the greatest proportion of crisis. It's a small country where close to 1/3 of the population in the country now are refugees. So think about like if suddenly there was like another, over the next couple years, 4 million people in New York City with no change of the infrastructure. And that most of them are prohibited from any kind of meaningful work unless it's under the table. What would that do to the political, social, infrastructure life here? And that's what's happening in Lebanon. You have a large number of Syrian refugees, but you also have Iraqi refugees that have fled mostly from northern Iraq with the sort of rise of violence of ISIS kind of, and some of the changes that Phyllis talked about in the Sunni areas there. Then you also have Palestinians who, for refugees that were living in Syria, and now they fled, and then there are Palestinian refugees that have been in Lebanon since 1948. I visited some of those refugee camps, and there were refugees hosting other refugees. And yet there are political leaders in this country saying, well, I'm not sure if we can handle, 10,000 refugees. It's appalling. That is just really insulting to people's dignity to suggest that. And I think one of the things I want to just raise for us is that refugees give us the opportunity to say, are some lives more important than others? So this externalization of casualties and of consequences of military actions, that if there are no US casualties, there aren't casualties. It's low intensity conflict, if we aren't suffering. And it's this us-them dynamic. And I think there's an opportunity for us to now say, you know, these are folks just like us. There's educated folks, there's farmers, there are bankers, there's jewelers, small business people, folks with disabilities who are like, how can I find care? I met some Syrian women who found it was more comfortable and worked better to be in a Palestinian refugee camp than in a refugee camp only for Syrians because they had a disabled child. And that was the place where they could get some services. So folks are scrambling to figure out, how do I just meet basic needs? And then how do I get on with my life when I still want to hold on to the fact that I want to return? And that was the most tragic aspect of these stories. And I think if we can lift those up, I want to say now just a couple things about some of the causes about that suddenly the world media discovered the refugee crisis this past summer when refugees started arriving in Europe. And so suddenly there was like, you know, there have been African refugees crossing the Mediterranean, also dying in a dangerous journey, and that wasn't getting the same kind of coverage. And so I just want to say, you know, like, let's use that opportunity. Let's be quite critical of why is it suddenly when they're coming to Europe. But what happened was there were folks that had been in Lebanon, had been in Turkey for 2, 3, 4 years now, couldn't find work, and we're beginning to say, you know, we can't go home. There is no home to go back to. We need to get on with our lives in some way. What next? And so there was this opening of, we can't find work here. The donations to the World Food Program, to the UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees, and the other programs that serve the refugee camps are coming in at about 35 to 40% funding. So if you don't have the money, they were reducing their food kits and their stipends that were available to refugees because they were like, we're going to run out. We've got too many refugees and we can't meet their needs. Then it's like you hear this announcement from Germany of, well, we could take a certain number of refugees. If folks are feeling like that, it's like there's not enough snow. It's like being in this camp, there aren't jobs. There isn't a way to resettle here. And there aren't the resources to kind of keep waiting, and there's no place to go back home anymore. Then it makes sense that people would risk their children's lives, their own lives, to cross the Mediterranean to try and get to a place where they feel maybe there's some jobs. And I just wanted that human piece is really important for us, so that if we could help with the funding of the World Food Program and of various other organizations on the ground, then maybe the need for folks to flee would go down. It wouldn't solve the problem. Now, I don't want to suggest that, like, you know, there's a difference between humanitarian assistance and trying to get at a genuine resolution. I want to say just a couple more things, and that is, I think, Phyllis, I want to come back to the militarization of problem solving. Political leaders have discovered that militarizing problem solving works for institutionalizing fear, and therefore stifling dissent. And its dictators and democracies are actually pretty good about this, that if you militarize the problem, then you have a monopoly on force as a government. And that could be the Assad regime, it could be the new regime in Iraq, it could have been Saddam Hussein before that, the US military and the US government, the various political leaders running for president right now. That's what we have to challenge, is to challenge the militarization that then refugees are just collateral damage instead of sisters and brothers. And it allows for this, if you institutionalize fear, you can blame the victims much more readily. And look at how refugees who are fleeing from a burning building, from a place that's been set on fire by all the weapons that have flooded Syria and Iraq over years, from the US military and from Saudis and from others. And then it's their fault that they got out of the way.